Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Messino, and I'm a professor of applied science at Trinity College. It's my honor and pleasure tonight to welcome you to the Restore Speaker Series on national parks, past, present, and future. I'm also delighted to be Restore's first official fellow. I'm a professor of applied science at Trinity College. And this speaker series is really a visionary opportunity to think about national parks, why they're important, and how we can think about them for our future. So tonight's event and the full Restore speaker series is co-sponsored by Trinity College and by Restore the North Woods in partnership with the Olmsted Network, the Walden Woods Project, and the Wildlands Campaign of Climate Action Now of Western Massachusetts. Please note that during our webinar, we will have the Q&A function open for questions, and we look forward to leaving plenty of time for questions after the presentation. We have closed captioning available, and please look for that on your navigation bar. We're recording the webinar, and we'll be able to send out the recording afterward. And I want to also have you mark your calendars looking ahead to the next talk in our speaker series, which will be on April 3rd, and will feature public historian Lawrence Cotton on giving a presentation titled Frederick Law Olmsted, The Natural Democracy of Parks. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Kellett, the Executive Director of Restore the North Woods. Michael?
Thanks, Susan. Glad to be here. Thanks, everybody, for being online. Restore the North Woods is a nonprofit organization. We're based in New England, and we work on parks, forests, wildlife, and restoring and rewilding nature. And so we're glad to be here. This series, the reason we're doing this is because national parks are a major way to benefit the climate, to benefit biodiversity, to benefit people. Yet they're really not getting enough attention in terms of the solution that they offer. So, and especially in this case, with talking about fire, science is showing us that national parks, wilderness, and other natural areas actually are less at risk for fire than areas that are managed by people. Yet the opposite is what we're hearing from the forestry people and the Forest Service and so forth. So we thought let's have a discussion looking at the myths that surround fire and what causes wildfires, how you address them, the role of national parks, and how national parks can actually benefit not only preventing wildfires that are really a problem because they're wild areas, but also that the real solution is to help people fireproof and fire resist their homes while leaving wildlands like national parks intact and allowing natural fires to operate as nature wants them to. So, Dina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yep, I'm going to introduce George Wuerthner. So George Wuerthner is an ecologist, writer, and photographer. He has published 34 books on geography, national parks, wilderness, conservation, history, and environmental issues, including wildfire, a century of failed forest policy. George also served as the Ecological Projects Director for the Foundation for Deep Ecology and Tompkins Conservation, and is currently an Executive Director of Public Lands Media as well as Board Chair of Restore the North Woods. And we are thrilled to welcome George Wuerthner as the lead speaker for the Restore series.
Okay, so now I try to do share. Let's see what happens. Share. There we go. Looks like we're working. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, all righty. Well, this was the book that was mentioned, Wildfire, A Century of Failed Forest Policy. And part of the reason we created this book was to try to put fire in a more positive viewpoint from an ecological and other perspectives. And the book has a lot of pictures of flowery meadows and wildlife, etc., using the lands that were burned at one time or another. And as I will talk about later on, the way to think about fire is as a rejuvenation rather than a destructive force. And there are, in some ways, you can say a lot of wildlife and plants live in mortal fear of green forests. And a lot of what I'm going to say in this talk is contrary to what you probably have heard in the past. All right, so let's see. Now I'm trying to make it go forward, and it's not happening. We got the first one. Let's see. Pause. No. And I have it shared. Yeah. Okay.
Try the
Share
right
again.
arrow button.
Okay, there we go. Okay. So what I want to talk about is that we need a paradigm shift. And I use the example of Copernicus, who challenged the idea that the sun circled the earth and the earth was the center of the universe. That, was the way most people thought about things for a long time. And you could make a pretty good argument and say, I see the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Obviously, it's circling the earth. Uh, but that is not actually scientifically correct. And that's the same with a lot of things with fire ecology, that what seems like the natural conclusion you should have from observation may be incorrect. And so it's counterintuitive. And I put this up just to remind me to talk about the idea that that we are circling the sun rather than the sun circling the earth. And science changes. Back in the around 1900s, it was a common thing to measure the skull of people. And what they found was that men's skulls were larger. And the assumption was that skull size determined intelligence. And of course, men tended to have larger skulls than women. And the conclusion was is that men were smarter than women. And and I put that in there to say that a lot of science, they're not incorrect. These scientists weren't trying to prove that about intelligence as much as their starting assumption was incorrect. And that's a lot of stuff in science is like that. So you have to be aware of the starting assumptions and work from there. So I've got some main themes to go over. One is large wildfires are driven by climate, not fuel. And that's contrary to a lot of what you will hear from the media and the Forest Service and other agencies. And another thing you will hear a lot is fire suppression has allowed fuels to build up. And that's the reason we have large fires. But that's not actually correct either. And then because of that assumption, in other words, those assumptions, I would say that fire suppression has allowed fuels to build up, and fuels are the reason we have large fires. Because of those assumptions, the conclusion is we must do more fuel treatments, that is logging, prescribed burning, and so forth, to prevent wildfires. But these things don't work under extreme fire weather conditions. And then even if they did work, active forest management, in other words, logging, etc., as in the picture to the right there, have consequences, collateral damage. So you have to ask yourself, how effective are these prescriptions, fuel treatments, and are they worth the damage that happens as a result? And my conclusions are they're not, and I hope to convince you of that. Also, high severity wildfire fires, which I will give you a definition of very quickly soon, create a unique habitat of snag forests. In other words, the trees in a forest fire usually don't burn up entirely. You have snags left afterwards. And those snag forests are very important ecologically. Also, our forests are not unhealthy. A lot of the rationale given for logging and so forth is to make the forest healthy. And finally, as mentioned by Michael, what you want to do is protect homes and community through home hardening. And home hardening has a lot of parts to it, but basically non-flammable roofs, clean out gutters, screen vents, keep burnable materials away from the side of a house like firewood or whatever. And that is the best way to survive fires. And this picture on the right was taken in Paradise, California, and you can see green trees all around, but the foundation burned to the ground, and there's still a volleyball net up. I mean, shows you the paradox in a lot of wildfires, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. Why do trees stay green while a house burns to the ground? Okay, here's my definitions. High severity fire means the majority of trees in an area, whatever area you're considering, are killed. So in the top part of the picture there, you can see all the trees are black, but they are still snags. Again, that's snag habitat. Mixed severity fire means 25 to 75% of the trees are killed. And sort of in the middle there, you see some green trees and some dead trees and so forth. So that'd be a mixed severity. And low severity means the majority of trees survive a fire, like at the bottom of the picture. In reality, probably, if you were to draw a line around most of the large fires that happen in the West, they're the percentage of all these things. So some of it's low severity, some of it's high severity. And if you were to put it all together, you'd find probably 70, 85% would be considered mixed severity, a mixture. So the other factor responsible for the increase in large fires and driving all large fires today is climate warming due to carbon emissions. All the recent climate attribute models showing fire increases relate to summer heat and vapor pressure deficit. In other words, the ability of trees or other plants to take in moisture to compensate for what they're losing through transpiration. I can't say the word right now. Through their somata, where they change moisture and carbon dioxide and so forth. So human spark wildfires are more destructive than those caused by nature. And that's kind of another interesting part. That's because they usually burn faster and they kill more trees than natural fires. The studies have shown human ignition is blamed for 84% of all wildfires in the United States and 75% of all those that threaten homes. And this is a figure that mostly applies to the West in terms of that's where the most wildfires are. But increasingly, we're seeing wildfires in the East too, and that's related to the climate change. Another thing that's a very interesting pattern is these fires start within 300 feet of a road. So out west, anyway, the Forest Service is advocating more logging to eliminate fuels so we have less wildfires, but they're creating all these roads to do the logging, which makes it easier for humans to ignite the wildfires that they're trying to prevent. So closure of roads can go a long ways towards reducing the number of fires. And then there's the whole thing of how much fires are resulting from just the fact that they remain small and don't do much. So in Yellowstone, between 1972 and 1987, there were 235 fires in the backcountry. And of those fires, 222 burned 5 acres or less. Most of them only burned an acre. And all went out without suppression. And this is an important point because we tend to try to suppress wildfires as soon as they show up. We take credit for putting out the fires when in fact they are likely to have self-extinguished themselves if they'd been left alone. But under extreme wildfire conditions, you get these high severity fires. But here's some statistics. There was 56,320 fires that burned 99 million acres in the Rocky Mountains between 1980 and 2003. And most of them burned less than an acre. And 98% of these fires accounted for only 4% of the area burned. In other words, even though you had tens of thousands of fires, most of them didn't burn anything. But of those fires, 2% of all fires accounted for 96% of the area burned. That's the ones burning under extreme fire conditions. And of those, 0.1% of all blazes were responsible for half of the acreage's charge. So these are the fires that all this public policy, logging, prescribed burning, etc., is designed to stop. And in fact, the majority of fires are not a threat, and the few that are a threat, those kind of policies can't control them, because the extreme fire weather, which is defined as drought, high temperatures, low humidity, and in particularly wind, blow fires across places where you've logged or where you've created fuel breaks or anything else. So this picture shows some clear cuts. There's obviously no fuel in those clear cuts, but it still burned the surrounding fire. The fire burned the surrounding forest here. Part of the confusion, from my view, comes from the idea of fire scar studies. The majority of research has involved what are called fire scars. They look for a tree, like you see in this picture, where there's a scar from a past fire, but it didn't kill the tree. And then they either drill into it, bore into it, or they cut it down. And they count the rings between scars. And then using those tree rings, they can say it was 20 years between a fire or 30 years between a fire. So here's an example of a tree that was cut down, and they marked the years when there were fires. But one of the problems with fire studies is they're not a random selection. You are looking for trees with scars, so you've automatically biased your study to trees that have fire scars. So what about all the other trees that didn't get fire scars? The second thing is the average interval in this example is every 10 years, but there was a naturally fire-free interval of 64 years where there were no fires. So is a 64-year fire-free period unnatural? So that's one of the problems. And then finally, what they do is what's called composite fire scars. This is getting into minutia, but just be aware that they put all these different years with fires together, and sometimes it might be just one tree that was hit by lightning, and yet that year is then counted as a fire year. And as you put more fire years together, you get a shorter and shorter interval between the fires. Anyway, that reconstruction has differed from other kinds of fire reconstructions: air photo interpretation, charcoal studies, pollen studies, government office reports, sediment studies, and so forth. These are other ways to determine fire frequency on the landscape and fire intervals. And usually they come up with a longer fire interval. So here's an example from Eastern Oregon using government land office surveys. And I'll explain this because I used to be a surveyor. But when you're a surveyor for the agency, Forest Service or the BLM or whatever, as you go along, you note what vegetation you are crossing through your survey line, which is a straight line. And you might say, for half a mile, I went through a burnt forest. And then the next part might be the next half mile, I went through some old growth forest. And so people are reading these surveys, which were done back in the 1800s, before there was any effective fire suppression or other factors, and finding that the conclusions about fire and tree density and so forth are different using the government land office survey than what they find with fire scar surveys. And not that this matters to a whole lot of people, but basically in this area of Oregon, the Forest Service says what they call low severity fire at the bottom dominated the forest, but this survey found that it was only 23.5% of the forest was low severity. So there was a big difference in the conclusion about the historical conditions. Another study found that high severity fires exceeding historic rates is not supported by the evidence in the review. In other words, they're saying we're getting more and more high severity fires today in terms of acreage burned. We are getting high severity fires, but and compared to the most recent past, and I'll explain why this is a wrong way to look at it. But if you go back far enough in history, they don't seem to be any more common than they were in the past. So here's one of the conclusions of a study. Traditional reference conditions of low severity fire regimes are inaccurate for most forests in Western North America. they seem to be characterized by mixed severity fires that includes ecologically significant amounts of weather-driven high severity fires. In other words, what they're saying is that a fire like you see on the right in the scene there, where there's mostly snags left, that would be a high severity fire, are not that unusual if you look at past fire rotations and regimes using these other methods. The other thing that's happening is what we call a shifting baseline. And the proponents of logging say that fires are worse than they were in the 1970s, which they attribute to fire suppression and fuel accumulation. But it was also a low point in fire acreage due to the Pacific Delta Oscillation climate, which to basically short during the whole period between the 1940s and into the 1980s, when Yellowstone burned, a big spike in the late 80s, the climate was cooler and moister. And if you have a cooler and moister climate regime, you have less ignitions. And even when you get ignition, they don't spread as much. So you don't get as many acreages burned. So if you start with the 1970s as your starting point, yeah, you can say the fires are burning more acreage today than in the past. But if you were to go back to the 1920s and 30s during the Dust Bowl days when it was real dry, you find that actually there was more acreage being burned back then than today. And this is the same basic thing, the cool point and the blue in the middle. But as much as 50 million acres was burning in seasons back in the early part of the last century. And today, if 10 million acres burn, we call it a very big fire season. So the climate really controls a lot of this. And these are things that last for decades, cool, moist areas. In fact, during the 1940s to the 1970s, which was a very cool time. In fact, in the early 1970s, scientists were saying we were entering another ice age, and glaciers were growing in the West. You hear now how glaciers are shrinking in places like Glacier National Park. But back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, they were actually growing because there was more snow happening and cooler temperatures. And then people use that as their starting point and say, oh, look at how we're getting larger fires now, but it was controlled by the weather. And the weather has changed. Why has it changed? Because we're putting so much carbon into the atmosphere and creating warmer temperatures. And those warmer temperatures allow vegetation to dry out more. It also contributes to higher wind speeds, which are also a big factor in fires, which I'll explain. But this is a chart here that goes back through centuries and shows that there were warm periods in the past and during those warm periods, there were significant fires. And then we went into the Little Ice Age, occurring, in the 1400s, 1600s until the 1800s. And then suddenly it started to get warmer again. So it's true that climate varies a lot, but the one good thing about these things is we can see how the climate affected things. So there was a thing called the medieval warm spell when there were huge fires around the West. And during this period is when the Pueblo Indians abandoned their dwellings, which correlates with the extensive fires that occurred. It was also the time when Greenland was colonized by the Vikings because it was really warmer then. And then the climate got colder and the Viking colonization disappeared. Anyway, if fuels drove large wildfires, we would have the largest fires in places like the Oregon Coast Range where there's more biomass than any place else. These old growth forests, they're really wet, they're lush, they have a lot of wood in them, but they don't burn very often because they're too wet. So to get a fire, you need fuel, but fuel alone won't get a fire to. And just like a car full of gas won't go anywhere unless you turn the ignition on and you shift the clutch and give gas on the accelerator. So it takes all those things together to make a car move, and it's the same thing that takes to have a big fire. So when you have extreme drought, low humidity, high temperatures, and wind, you get unstoppable fires. And the biggest factor of all large fires is wind. Strong winds equal big fires. A recent study found that 90% of the acreage burn occurred during periods of strong winds. So keep that in mind, like the fires that were just in California and Pacific Palisades and Altadena, the wind was blowing up to 100 miles an hour. And when you have 100-mile-an-hour winds, you have all these embers getting blown ahead of the fire front that will jump over logged areas, will jump over places that are prescribed burn. They'll jump, 10 lane, 12 lane interstate highways. It'll jump anything you're trying to put in its way. And the embers are often blown several miles ahead of the fire front, like you see in this picture with all those embers sparking. So extreme winds is the main factor in large fires. And there's nothing you can do to stop those embers from being blown during these high winds. So the only other solution you have is to make sure that your home or house isn't vulnerable to the embers. And one of the ways that wind affects things as fire spread is it's exponential too. It's not linear. So as in this diagram, a 20-mile-an-hour wind, which is the curve that's sharper up, spreads fire that much quicker than a 15-mile-an-hour wind. And of course, imagine what it's like with a 100-mile-an-hour wind, like was happening in Southern California recently. I mean, you're just not going to stop fires when they got those kind of winds behind them. And you can see how this is wind affects things. This was in Yellowstone in 1988. That's Yellowstone Lake in the background, the blue. But you can see how the wind had a direction to it. You can see how the fire burned, pushed by the wind, and it has what they call spot fires. Those black spots ahead of the main fire front are all new fires that were started by the blowing embers getting blown ahead of the fire front. And that's why it's pretty hard to stop them. And the firefighters don't try to stop them because they know they'll be dangerous to get in front of a fire front with a high wind. And here's a specific chart that shows how this works. And this is, I know, kind of hard to read, but the thing to look at is the green line, which is the wind speed. And at the point here in sort of the left-hand part of it, the wind was gusting at 41 miles an hour. And then you can see the green line goes down and goes down below 10 miles an hour. And at the same time, the red line is the humidity, and the humidity goes way up. In fact, it rained. So what happened then? The fire came under control. And what really happened is that the weather changed. And if you listen carefully to meteor reports, they almost always say that. They'll say, "Oh, the firefighters got it under control because it rained, or the wind died down." In fact, when I was doing a book on Yellowstone fires, I was reading this old report from the 1930s, and this ranger was on typewritten, typewriter written report, and the guy says, "We finally got the fire under control, had a hell of a time breaking camp in the rain." Sort of like as if their efforts got the fire under control and not the rain. So here's a fire that burned in Colorado, and this is an infrared picture. So the red is the green on burned forest, and the green in this picture is the burnt forest, and the black lines are where they thin the forest. And you can see that the majority of the burning occurred where they thinned the forest, not in the part of the forest that wasn't treated. And that is a very common finding, that thinned areas burned at higher severity. And you may ask, "Oh, why is that? That doesn't seem to make sense." Well, it does make sense in several ways. One, when a forest is thin, like in this picture here, it's much more open. And if wind is a big factor in spreading fire, when you have a much more open forest, the wind can move those embers around. The other is that the forest dries out more because it doesn't have as much shade. So you can get a high severity fire more likely in areas that are thinned than in areas that are left in their sort of natural denser condition. And the arrow is pointing to a stump there. The reason I have that pointed out is you can see all these black stumps in the background. That shows that they were cut prior to the fire. This is when it had been thinned. You can see there were far more trees there where you see all those black stumps. And of course, the fire came through and then it left them black on top. Here's another example. And this was the Holiday Farm fire in the Western Cascades. And I was actually up in the Cascade Mountains when this fire started. And I could see all the smoke, and the wind was blowing like a hurricane. And I was worried about whether I could get out from the trailhead I was at. I raced, I was backpacking. I raced back to my car and got away. But the arrow I have is pointing to a reservoir there. And you can see the color on this map. The red is the high severity fire burn, the yellow is mixed severity, and then the green is where there was little or no burn. So notice where that reservoir is, and there's the same reservoir, and you can see that the area that was burnt with a lot of mixed and high severity was severely logged. And the idea is if logging was going to stop high severity fires, one would think that this area that had been severely logged would have not burned much. And another thing to notice is the upper right-hand corner has no logging. And you can see in this picture again that there's hardly, it's mostly green. In other words, where they didn't log is mostly green, where they logged is high severity burn. And this is a common thing that's found in a lot of burns. Here's another one. I happen to be driving through, this is by Mount Lassen in Northern California, and I came upon this area where they had just thinned the forest, and you can see that the trees are widely spaced. And then it turned out that the Dixie Fire, which was the largest fire in California that year, burnt right through that same place in September. And I went back and as close as I could find to the same area, and here again, the blacktop stumps. See, the tops of these stumps here are white before the fire, and so the fire burned through this thin area, and obviously the thinning, even though it was pretty severe and logged area, did not stop the fire from burning through there. And this is a map showing that all the colors here, the orange and stuff, shows places that had been previously logged in the Dixie Fire. The place where I was showing in that picture was right about in here, where I'm hitting with my little arrow. But you can see it had been previously logged, as I observed, and the fire burned right through that. Then this is the Thomas Fire, which burned near Santa Barbara, 200,000 acres, pretty good sized fire. And the only thing that stopped it was the Pacific Ocean. And that was a fire break that worked, but most fire breaks don't work. And we don't have Pacific Ocean always in the way. But this fire jumped this is Highway 101 in California, jumped both the multiple lanes of that area, which has no fuel, and burnt. And this is all burned to the, all this that you can see is burnt vegetation all the way down to the ocean. Here's another one. This was the Eagle Creek fire that burned in Oregon. This is in the Columbia Gorge near Portland. And again, this was a mosaic burn. You can kind of see how up here it was all high severity, but then down here it didn't hardly burn at all. And here's a mixed severity. But anyway, this fire, the wind blew embers across the river. I'm on the Washington side where I'm taking the picture, and behind me the forest was burnt from embers that reached it from that side, even though you had the Columbia River, which was 1.5 miles wide here, as a fire break, and it didn't work. So the majority of acreage burned by a wildfire in the U.S. occurs only in very few wildfire situations under extreme conditions. And so under these conditions, suppression efforts are largely ineffective. And I should mention here, one of the reasons why national parks are a good scientific control is because the natural policy, or the policy of most national parks, is to allow natural processes, which includes wildfire, to affect the landscape and not be inhibited. That doesn't mean that they don't sometimes put out fires in national parks, but it is usually not the objective, and they try to only to protect buildings and things like that, not as a general suppression effort. And this is another study that found that extreme environmental conditions overwhelm most fuel treatments, i.e. logging or prescribed burning. And another study says that fuel treatments can't realistically expected to eliminate large areas in severe fire weather. And the reason I'm giving you all these is because you can read scientific studies that say that thinning and prescribed burning work, but you have to look carefully and see, well, what other conditions were those fires where it worked burning? And what you find in most cases, it is not extreme fire weather conditions. It's more what they call low to moderate fire weather conditions. And yes, under those conditions, thinning or prescribed burning may appear to work. But again, as I earlier pointed out, most of those fires would go out on their own and self-extinguish anyway, without any suppression. So even the Congressional Research Service looked at this issue, and they found that there's a weak relationship between acres logged and the extent and severity of forest fires. The data indicates that fewer acres burned in areas where logging activity was limited. This is just so contrary to everything we're being told. We're being told that the way to stop these big fires is to log the area. Yet there's evidence over and over and over again that is contrary. Here's another study that was done in 2016, and this is what was called you would call a review study, where they looked at 1,500 fires. And what they did is they geographically located these fires and they said, okay, where are these fires located? Are they in areas with active forest management, logging, or are they in places like national parks that are protected from logging or other activities like that? And they found that forests with higher levels of protection had lower severity fire values, even though they are generally identified as having the highest levels of biomass fuel loading. So that basically what they're saying is that, again, the same conclusions, that except that they looked at a whole lot of fires and came to the same conclusion that logging actually increased fires. And Congress got a letter in 2018 from 200 scientists, and the letter said, thinning is the most often proposed to reduce fire risk and lower fire intensity. However, the climate changes. Most of our fires will occur during extreme fire weather, high winds, temperature, low humidity, low vegetation. They were copying some of my articles. Now, these fires, like the ones burning in the West this summer, will affect large landscapes regardless of thinning, and in some cases burn hundreds of thousands of acres in a few days. That didn't get anywhere with Congress because they are beholden to the timber industry in a lot of places, and so they take the timber industry one. And there's another thing I want to mention. You have to look at where the money comes from for studies. You will find that a lot of Western universities have forestry schools. And you will find that the timber industry funds a lot of the research in those forestry schools. And so what you have is people come out of forestry schools with this sort of general bias suggesting that logging is a good thing, or even if it's not great, we can mitigate some of the bad things of it. And then they go to work for the Forest Service or whoever, and they get, if they're a fire researcher, they get a lot of their funding from the Forest Service, which has again a bias towards logging. And so, and I'm not saying that these people purposely lie. It's how you pose the question and what assumptions you have that lead to the conclusions you see. But nevertheless, the first thing I do is I look at a scientific paper and I see who are they associated with and where do they get their funding. And what I've found is research done by non-forestry schools and geography departments, geology departments, etc., tend to have come to different conclusions about wildfire than a lot of the forestry school research. Another thing that's sort of counterintuitive is live trees are more flammable than dead trees. And that's another contrary thing. You hear all the time, well, the bark beetles killed a lot of trees here, so now we're going to have bad wildfires. No, not necessarily at all, because the green trees have these resins and they have all this fine fuel and needles and branches that make them flammable. So there's a picture I took in Yellowstone in 1988. I mean, it looks like gasoline. It exploded into flames and it was a green tree because of these resins. So trees don't burn just the fine fuels like needles and stuff, which is why you get snags back. And the snags are critical to ecosystem health and carbon storage. And so we have this dichotomy that's often presented, good fire versus bad fire, but ecologically, there's no such thing as a bad fire. It's a natural component of all Western ecosystems and some Eastern ecosystems as well. The frequency and severity does vary with plant communities, but when you get snags like you see on the right, there's a lot of species that are dependent upon those snags in the forest. So we have logging like on the left and prescribed burns, which are considered a solution, and they have collateral damage. And part of this is driven by the Southwest pine model, which was developed in like Arizona primarily, but somewhat in New Mexico too. Where they said the fires are characterized by frequent 1 to 20 years between fires. But that's industrial forestry thinking, because it doesn't apply to almost all the plant communities in the West. It may apply to ponderosa pine somewhat, but even that, it doesn't apply even in all ponderosa pine forests. So the mindset that all high severity fires are bad and we need to actively manage them is a euphemism for logging, that is active management. So we kill the trees to save them from the chainsaw medicine. And I love this cartoon. You see this right here, Jimmy? There's another time when the old fellow miraculously survived some big forest fire. And what you find with the agencies today, they think that I call chainsaw medicine. They say the forests are sick and they need to be cured, and the way we cure the forest is by logging them with a chainsaw. But if the trees die because of bark beetles or wildfire or drought or some other natural calamity, that's not acceptable. Just like this cartoon, they survive that miraculously, and then we save them with chainsaws. Okay, so the other problem with all this solution is logging is not benign. Thinning reduces the future snags and down wood, which many species depend on for hiding cover, or in case of things like fungi and bacteria that decompose the trees, they depend on that dead wood. Most thinning requires logging roads, and logging roads increase sedimentation in streams and erosion, soil erosion. Logging roads spread weeds, logging disrupts and displaces wildlife. And so you have all these negatives, and then the counter of that is the probability that any fire will encounter one of these treated areas is extremely low. Some estimates of less than 1%. So you're getting all these impacts, including loss of carbon storage too, by the way. And they never encounter a fire in any kind of reasonable time. So we get all the damage, and we're trying to prevent something that may never happen. So the industrial forestry paradigm of thinning, logging, etc., creates a sanitized, simplified forest with few dead snags and down wood. This is a certified sustainable forestry site in Northern California that I visited. I've been to about 6 or 7 of these. And the proponents were all saying, look at how healthy this forest is. There's all these green trees. And what they don't acknowledge is that actually dead trees are important to the ecosystem. And so here you have where a tree has been cut down. That would have normally been a snag on the ground, and or been a snag, maybe a cavity nesting birds would use. And this is another simplified ecosystem on the Deschutes Forest in Oregon. And there's nothing there. There's no ground cover for rodents to hide or birds nesting on the ground. There's no flowers for bees. This is a really degraded landscape, and the Forest Service is very proud of this, and in the name of forest health. So in many years, the other thing is, in many years, more non-forested areas burn. So this whole solution, logging, is going to save communities, ignores that a lot of our large fires occur in grass and shrublands. So the Maui fire in Hawaii, the Marshall fire in Colorado, the Soda fire in Idaho, the Smokehouse fire in Texas, Long Drawn. These are all, like the Smokehouse fire burned over 1 million acres in Texas a couple of years ago. These are really big fires. And the most recent ones here in Southern California, Altadena and Pacific Palisades, I just took this a month ago. This is in Altadena. And this was a fire that started in Chaparral. So no trees. So even if you had, logging wouldn't have prevented Altadena from burning up. The other thing you hear is if we only graze the land, we reduce the fuels. And as you can see here, there's no fuel sitting here. So that's true. It does reduce the fuels, but the unfortunate thing is that grazing tends to increase cheatgrass, which is a very flammable grass that actually increases the fire hazard. The other thing is that logging removes the carbon from the forest, and a fire releases some carbon, but not nearly as much as logging, as in this chart here shows. So the logging took a lot more of the original carbon from the forest. And logging gives emissions in many ways. This is in Oregon, where logging, it's the green in this chart, pie chart, it was the biggest factor in greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. And forests only accounted burning forest fires only accounted for 4% of the total carbon emissions. And that that wood products industry is bigger than all the transportation and all the cars and all the other things we always hear about causing emissions, which they do. But logging is even worse. And then we have this whole cultural thing going on about Indian burning. And the Indians definitely did set fires, but they affected a very small part of the landscape. Plus, some of these people who advocate Indian burning say the Indians kept the forest healthy. Well, ponderosa pine, which is in the left-hand side of the picture there, existed for 55 million years. And humans only arrived in North America 15, 16,000 years ago. And you have to say, well, how did the ponderosa pine forest survive for millions of years without any human manipulation? In other words, I think it's a bogus argument. The forests are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, which tends to be the national park policies in general. The other thing, as I mentioned, a lot of plant communities in the West have very long fire rotations and couldn't have been affected by fire suppression even if it did exist, because if you have like the very top one, Pacific Northwest Douglas fir, that has a fire interval of up to 1,000 years. In other words, it got 1,000 years without a fire. Even if fire suppression had been successful for 100 years, if you got 1,000 years between fires and you have that variability, it could be at 500 years or 600 years. 100 years is not going to make any difference in that ecosystem. And it's the same for all these other ecosystems down here that are mentioned, all the way down the sagebrush and chaparral, all have fire rotations that are longer than fire suppression could have been effective. The other reason that fire fuel reductions like prescribed burns they may influence things, as I mentioned, under low to moderate fire weather, but they don't work on a landscape scale. It's like using a watering can and calling it a river. So they just don't affect enough. And the effectiveness is short-lived too. This on the left is a place that was burned 3 years ago, and all this grass grew back, and grass is very flashy. It will burn better than what was there prior to the prescribed burn. And on the right-hand side is another place where there's a prescribed burn. And this is cheatgrass, the very flammable grass I mentioned that came in after the prescribed burning. And there's been research that shows that that though Indian burning, like I said, did occur, it did not affect whole landscapes. This was a research that was done in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, which had probably one of the most dense tribal populations in the West, because they had salmon, mild climate, etc. And the research showed that most fires were fairly localized, and broad changes in fire activity seemed to track large-scale variations in climate. In other words, the fires were affected by climate. The same thing in Yosemite Valley. Our records indicate climate changes influence burning at all spatial scales. Native American influence appeared to have been local. Another study in Grand Teton National Park, comparison of 3 charcoal records for the last 550 years indicates widespread fire episodes, and it lists the dates, and evidence of human influence was muted at best. Native Americans apparently did not alter vegetation and fire regimes significantly during their occupation of Jackson Hole. And then this was study in New England, and it said basically says that there's no pollen evidence or charcoal evidence for regionally extensive human impacts or open land vegetation. And their conclusion was that local ecological impacts, that the small scale fishing, hunting, and farming resulted in local ecological impacts without transforming the broader forested landscape. Basically, we're saying that tribal burning didn't influence things from that research, but we have evolutionary evidence for this. For example, sagebrush tends to burn anywhere from 50 to 400-year rotations. And sagebrush is low elevation. There were a lot of tribes living in sagebrush ecosystem. If they were burning entire landscapes, we wouldn't have sagebrush left. We wouldn't have sage-grouse. We wouldn't have sage thrasher. We wouldn't have pygmy rabbits. Sagebrush is one of the most widespread plant communities in the West. The same with chaparral, which has no specific frequent fire rotation. In other words, if fires were burning this every 10 years or something like that, chaparral would disappear as well. And so that's evolutionary evidence that Indian burning didn't affect a lot of the landscape. And as I mentioned, sagebrush has no adaptations to fire, and we have sagebrush obligate species like sage grouse that live there. Okay, so a healthy forest ecosystem has a lot of biological legacy and complexity, dead snags, down wood, and so forth. And trying to preclude insects, wildfire, and other mortality to create, quote, healthy forests is thwarting evolution. We actually need these factors to help select which trees are best adapted to current and future conditions. And I'll give you an example. There are some tree within any group of trees, you would find that there's a wide variation in their genetics, say to drought conditions. Some trees are better adapted to drought and others aren't. So during long periods of drought, like the medieval warm spell that occurred 800 to 1300 AD, those trees that had those genetics for drought to tolerate drought would be the ones that would survive and eventually populate the area. And so when we come in and log, though, we don't know which trees have an adaptation to drought or to insects or these other things. And so when they go and log and say that they're making the forest healthy, they're actually doing the opposite, they're degrading the forest. And this is an interesting thing. High severity blazes enhance biodiversity. It's the biodiversity is second highest where there's your severe burns. So we're trying to stop these large fires from occurring, and yet they are very important ecologically. And as I mentioned, many species are recovering from green forests. They need these snags and wildfires. And this is a quote from a poet, Robinson. Oh gosh, I forget his last name right now. But anyway, but what the wolf's tooth whittled so fine the fleet limbs of the antelope, Robinson Jeffers. And the point being is that the predation from the wolf made the antelope fast, and wildfires are whittling the forest and making them adapted to things like fire and insects, etc. And 45% of all bird species in the West depend on dead trees and down wood. If you want to eliminate high severity fires, you're saying you don't want these birds around. Even bats rest in the flaky bark of dead trees. Who would think of that? Well, bats, some of them are becoming endangered due to white nose syndrome, but nevertheless, they're also losing their habitat when we try to prevent all these natural processes like drought and wildfire and insects from killing trees. Some research suggests that there's higher bee density and diversity in high severity fire areas. And part of that is two things. One, native bees in the West rely on fallen logs for prime habitat. In Oregon, for example, there are over 800 species of native bees. And a lot of them are becoming endangered because they don't have as many fallen logs for their habitat. And then they also depend on the flowers that come in after wildfires. 50% of all fish habitat in streams comes from fallen logs. More logs equals more fish, as you see here, the logs in there. And fuel reductions are ineffective and inefficient. This is a quote from a fire researcher in Missoula who says, what we want to do is reduce the flammability of the homes rather than do all this logging and manipulation in the forest ecosystem. Here's the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado. Notice how you got green trees all around the foundations of those houses that burned to the ground. Here's another one. This is in Paradise, California. Green trees all around the foundation of these houses that burned to the ground. Why are the trees green while the houses burn down? Because actually the trees still are moisture. They have more moisture than the buildings, which are made out of dry wood and timber, and they have things like plastics and other things that burn really well. So you see this over and over again in the West where these fires come through, and it's not like it wasn't a wall of flame that caused these houses to burn to their foundation. It was embers blown by the wind. And in this case, at the campfire in Paradise, the winds were blowing 70, 80 miles an hour. So you treat the fuels immediately next to the residence and try to reduce the chances that they will ignite. So here's a picture I took in Colorado. You can see there's houses that survived the fire, but this one burned down. I don't know why it burned down because I wasn't there before the fire, but obviously some houses are more vulnerable than others. So here's the recommendations. You keep vegetation at least 5 feet away from structures, and that's estimated to reduce losses up to 52%. I mean, it's pretty significant. use internal buffers like parks and so forth, which can reduce the fire spread in a town. And combine all these things together, and you can reduce losses, and like the campfire did to Paradise, by 75%, and translates into a 55% reduction. So things like clean the gutters, get material off the roof, have non-flammable roofs, get screen vents, remove flammable materials like wood piles from the house, put sprinklers on the roof. Here's a house in Bend, Oregon, and you can see there's pine needles up on the roof right here. The gutters are probably full of them. They've got shrubs right next to the house foundation. They got trees right over the house. This is a house getting ready to burn. And if the right fire conditions come along, this is probably a house that will die. Not die, but burn up. The other thing is you have to think outside the box. Like I read about a fire down in LA that burned down a bunch of houses, and what they noticed is most of the houses that burned down had doggy doors. And of course, doggy doors are made to swing open in winds, and so you have high winds, and the embers got blown into the houses and started the fires. I know of another house in Montana that had these hanging flower things, and the flower things caught on fire, and they were on rope like you see here. The rope caught on fire and burned. This fell to the deck below and started the house and burned the house down. So here's a concluding remarks. We must reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's carbon in the atmosphere. Climate warming is accelerating fire spread inside. That's the ultimate cause of these things. And climate weather drives the large fires. So unless we start dealing with the climate, we're going to keep on getting these big fires. Worse about fuel reductions, etc., is that they are expensive, and the probability that a large blaze will actually encounter them is very low, and they're costly. And wildfire and natural events like bark beetles and wildfire and so forth invigorate ecosystems. They don't destroy them, they don't degrade them. We need them. And large wildfires and bark beetles provide the bulk of dead tree recruitment in forest ecosystems. So if you find that dead trees are important to the ecosystem, then you have to allow these natural processes to occur. And the way to protect communities is to reduce home flammability and zoning to prevent building in the fire plain. And finally, I always put a pitch for forest elves. They need fires like you see the scar on this tree, and they live in these forested areas, and wildfires are very important for them to create the habitat that they need. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. So somebody take over here.
Whoops. Thank you so much, George. I think my camera's blank, but I wanted to just, we started a couple minutes late, so I wanted to just have a couple minutes for questions and offer Michael Kellett the first one. That was really a tour de force, George. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Yeah, George, the common question, Restore the North Woods, it does most of our work in the East and the
Yes.
upper Midwest. And we're hearing more and more that climate change and disturbances from insects and disease are increasing the threat of wildfires even in this region. And that in order to deal with that, we need to do thinning and prescribe burning and the things that you were talking about. On the other hand, we have hardly any of the region protected as national parks and wildlands. So what do you think makes the most sense in terms of addressing the issue of fire in the Northeast?
Well, as I mentioned, climate change is driving some of these things. However, periodically in the past, there have been drier periods and so forth. And what I would say, I know you will agree with this, is that we need more protected landscapes as wilderness and parks as controls to show how, in many cases, if you're logging like in the White Mountain National Forest, like the Forest Service does, you're leaving a lot of brush and fine fuels. Those are the things that drive fires. Also, you're opening up the forest. And you can tell this yourself. Go on a windy day, hide in the dense forest, and you hardly feel the wind. And then if you go out on an open ridge, it's just blowing like a hurricane. So the solutions that they're proposing will only exacerbate the fire spread to any ignitions that might happen. And the other part of it is, since humans are such an important part of that, reducing the road, as I mentioned early on, reduces the chances of human ignitions getting started in the first place. And the only other thing, in the eastern United States, for the most part, there are some exceptions. I'm going to generalize, but in general, the summer months are very moist. That's when you get a lot of rainfall and so forth. So they're less likely to get fires during those times. The time when you get most of the fires in the east is like in the spring, when the leaves are on the ground, but the forest is still open because you don't have new green leaves growing and shading it and so forth. So there's a limited time period when you're more likely to get ignition that might spread. But in general, like in Vermont and upper New England and stuff, at least prior to this recent increase in climate carbon, fires had a rotation of like 1,000-year rotation. Basically, they're non-existent, and it takes very unusual circumstances. There were some big fires back in the early 1900s in the Adirondacks that were started actually in logged over areas, and that's what contributed to these big fires in that area from the rubble and debris left after the logging that occurred. So, my basic answer is less active management, and one of the ways you can achieve that is by having more protected landscapes. More protected landscapes, the best ones are wilderness or parks, and they're not mutually exclusive, as you know, because you can have a wilderness overlay on park lands as well. So.
Thank you. Thank you, George. I just want to let everyone know that George is actually joining us from just at the doorstep of Yellowstone National Park right now. So he's right there in the wilderness, which is wonderful. We're all jealous about that. And in case you wanted to see his book, which may have looked small in his title slide, it's actually large. It's quite a tome. And also, while you were talking about phrenology, I got my little phrenology model out.
Right.
And this is something that I often show my students, how we had very interesting things assigned to different parts of the brain, which I won't go into right now. But I'm just wondering, I know that there was, obviously the news can, shape people's opinions. And there were a number of fires in the Northeast this past fall. And if you really read carefully, they were all started in brushy areas. They were all started by people. Most of them were very small.
Right.
And so that's, I think the issue. And I've been trying to understand what are even the penalties for starting these fires. And this is just a really out of the box question that I know you may not have been expecting, but I've been trying to look into. As an aside, I lived in Southern California, and we had to evacuate for the Laguna Canyon fire, which burned up a beautiful canyon. We found out later that it was started by arson, and I just hardly hear. Given the number of fires, I hardly hear of people that are being prosecuted or serious forensics being done in terms of trying to prevent these fires by people understanding the seriousness and facing consequences.
Well, in truth, it's hard. It's easy to tell usually if it's a human ignition that starts these fires, because they can trace it back to the original point and often tell what started it. But who started it becomes problematic unless they have some sort of video camera or some other reason why they could tell that. The other thing to keep in mind too is that a lot of fires are started by just chance kind of accidents. Like there was a big fire by Redding, California, a couple of years ago called the Car Fire. And what it was a guy was dragging a trailer and he got a flat tire and he pulled over on the side of the road, which was grassy, and the tire rim was sparking, and that started this 200 and some thousand acre fire. So that would be something that you couldn't prevent, it's just sort of accidental. But arson, particularly in California, is a big thing. And what they found too, I don't want to cast dispersion upon anybody, but sometimes it's even firefighters that start these fires, because if it's a low a low fire year, you're not making as much money, and sometimes that's the source of fires too. But in general, if they do know who started it, and they will sometimes come after that person to pay, which usually the person has to declare bankruptcy, because we're talking millions of dollars and they can't pay for the cost of the fire suppression. But they do try to, if they know who did it, they try to make a point of, taking them to court and making them face a trial as a result. But a lot of it is going to be just things that we'll never know why it, got started or how it got started. And in terms of the human sources of the ignition. But the other thing too is interesting, why you got me on the point, is that natural fires started by lightning tend to be um, uh, less severe a lot of times than the human cause, because the lightning fires usually start on ridge tops and stuff where there's less fuel, and and it's usually moisture and so forth. The conditions for fire spread are not as good at higher elevations, whereas the human caused fires are down in the valley where you're in the drier terrain, and the fuel is abundant there, and so human caused fires also burn differently in a sense than the natural
Yeah.
fires.
Thank you.
Yeah.
George, one question related to where you are, excuse me, which is right outside of Yellowstone. Yeah, I know you were in the park today. Is I know that you were there in 1988 when the huge wildfires happened, which
Yes.
at the time, I remember them, and people were saying, "Oh, they should have been logging before that and thinning, and it would have prevented the fires." And after the fires, they said, "Oh, it's a disaster, and we're going to have to salvage, take out all those dead trees because it's going to, be even worse." What has been your observation in terms of Yellowstone? What has happened since those fires?
Well, an interesting thing, and this has been found in other places, is that the highest density of tree regrowth was in the areas that burned at the highest severity. And that partly has to do with the dominant tree here in Yellowstone is lodgepole pine, which has serotinous cones that open after they're heated. So where the fire was hottest, you had more cones opening up. So you actually have more trees in those high severity patches than you have in the lower severity patches. But the newspaper and the media's talk about how Yellowstone has recovered, and I'm glad they're putting out articles like that. But I don't even like to use the word recover, because that assumes that you recover from cancer, right, or something bad, heart attack. And I don't like to frame it that way. What I like to say is that the forest has been rejuvenated. It's a sort of a more happy or less biased pejorative terminology, and um, and and it has across the board, and all these things, like I mentioned, the logs in the forest they've shown that they have more fish in the areas that burned at high severity than wasn't, because they get a lot more nutrients getting into the stream, which in turn feeds the aquatic insects, which in turn feeds the fish. And this is another interesting thing too. There's more birds and bats above those streams too, because the aquatic insects fly above the stream, and so there's more insects for the bats and birds. So even the terrestrial species that depend on our land base benefit in those areas where the streams have had a high severity. And the other thing that they found, and this is a great thing, if you come to Yellowstone, you'll see signs around the park that says uh, restored by natural succession or something like that. And the joke of that is, just outside the park on the Targhee National Forest, which was severely overcut back in the 1980s, the Forest Service, to try to make amends, so to speak, had these signs out there saying naturally replanted after logging and 1985 or whatever like that. So the Park Service has these signs that naturally replanted by nature 1988, you know. So you got to know the joke. It's a joke and a good comment.
That's That's interesting. Well, I mean, the organizations definitely have different missions, and the Forest Service is very honest that they have a mission of timber and mining and kind of natural resource extraction. So that's sort of, what is going on. I know we need to wrap up, but I just want to make a small final point about water. And the point that you showed on the burned areas near the water and the unlogged areas were the areas that hadn't burned.
Mhm.
And just an increasing awareness of that older forests and these natural forests are wetter, which is itself a buffer system against
Exactly.
burning. And I want to make a plug for an old book that's expensive now, but it's really powerful. Biotic Regulation of Climate, which is talking not just about carbon, but about the genetic knowledge. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, George, the genetic knowledge that's held in these ecosystems where these systems are a web of life that knows how to regulate itself and recover and move water across the land. And I wanted to see if you agree that in general, areas that are intact near water are less likely to burn than other areas, because that seems to be a very common sense thing. So if we want to set up a network that can function and be more fire resistant and keep our landscapes healthy, we need to protect the land around our water. And I just feel like we're not really talking about that sufficiently.
Yeah, well, your intuition is exactly right. In fact, the little side part, when big old logs fall on the ground, they soak up water. They're actually little mini fire breaks. And so when the Forest
Yes.
Service comes in and quotes salvage logs and gets rid of those logs, they're actually again making it more vulnerable to a future fire. The other thing that they found in the West that's kind of interesting, and I know there's a lot of this in the East too, is beaver dams. Uh, Create little ponds, and those little ponds help to sub irrigate the surrounding landscape. It's not just right near the water, but for quite a distance out, their water levels are increased, the groundwater and so forth, and keeps the plant communities moister and therefore less likely to burn. Those become the patches in a fire that don't burn. And that's another point I think is important. I didn't really emphasize it, but most wildfires are a mosaic where you get some burn patches in some places that you don't usually see a continuous 100,000 acres of high severity. There'll be patches in there that don't, and that can be because maybe the wind died down for a couple hours when the fire hit that patch, or maybe it hit a wet spot like you're saying, and that resisted the burn. And the trees that are well hydrated are less likely to burn. In 1988, when the Yellowstone fires happened, the internal moisture of trees in the park, because it was the driest year ever recorded, was about 1% internal moisture. Kiln dry lumber is 15%. So the trees, even though they're green, like I was pointing out, but they have all these resins, and they were extremely dry because of this drought, because they're constantly trying to bring moisture out of the ground, right? And they're giving off the moisture through their needles, and they're drying out the internal moisture of the tree itself and making it more likely to burn. So anyway.
Wow. Thank you. I think we'll probably need to wrap it up because we promised this is only going to be an hour and we're a little bit over. Michael, did you have any concluding comments?
No, I just thank you, George, and thank you, Dina, for helping to make this possible. We have a wonderful student from Trinity, Dina Chime, who doesn't get much credit here, but helped to make this possible. So thank you very much for all your technical and logistical help. So, and George, thank you, of course, for your inspired presentation.
Sure.
Yes,
Fun.
George, as I said, that was an absolute tour de force. And Dina is actually even more involved in the next talk, which I want to remind everyone about, is on April 3rd, Lawrence Cotton, Frederick Law Olmsted, The Natural Democracy of Parks. And Dina and another student, Tien Nguyen, who's abroad this semester, have been working with me on a wonderful project on Frederick Law Olmsted in Hartford. So we're delighted to be sharing this with everyone when we see you again, hopefully on April 3rd at 7 p.m. So thank you, everyone. And I guess goodbye for now. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody, too.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Let's see, trying to